Salam ala Rasulillah. My name is Imam Yusuf Rios, and I welcome you to the second installation of this series of reflections on the last 10 days of Ramadan. When we look at the reality of Iman, we're obligated to believe in the unseen. And in believing in the unseen, we believe in revelation and we believe in the dynamics that there's something going on that's more than meets the eye, so to speak. The Quran itself, we believe that it comes from the unseen to us by way of revelation, by way of the angel Jibreel from Allah to us. It was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who's representative of us as a whole. And we find an ayat in the Quran that speaks to us about a reality which permeates the dunya itself with regard to the relationship that Allah has to us. In this ayah, Allah says, وَاللَّهُ يَدْعُو إِلَى الْجَنَّةِ وَالْمَغْفِرَةِ بِإِذْنِهِ. That Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is calling us, is inviting us to Jannah and to forgiveness by His permission. And so we want to harp on a point here that our action is not the means in and of itself by which we get into Jannah, but rather our action is a means that allows us to understand what is the mode of ibadah that we should take. Our action is a means that's prescribed, but ultimately we're depending upon Allah wa Ta'ala. We're depending upon the forgiveness of Allah. We're not depending upon our actions in and of themselves as though they obligate Allah to something, but rather our action is for our own benefit. And this is why Maulana Maududi, when he talks about fasting and other acts of ibadah, he talks about them from the angle of the objectives that they have, and from the angle of these means of worship as being, a training, right? That we're supposed to cultivate within that training certain qualities, rather than just look at the act of worship as an end in itself. It's a means by which to instill in us certain qualities. And when we look at the reality of the Islamic movement and its educational orientation, it is ultimately an educational orientation that is calling us to action, is calling us to cultivate certain qualities that will allow us to be transformative in the world. One of the first things that we have to get right in our understanding is some of these dynamics that govern the unseen. And of these dynamics, again, we mentioned that we should believe with certainty that Allah is calling us to Jannah and to forgiveness. That's important because then we begin to have a solid understanding of who Allah is in relation to us, and we see Allah as being in our favor. And when we look on the other hand, we see that Shaitan, he threatens us, يعيدكم الفقر ويأمركم بالفحشاء, right? Shaitan, one of his qualities, he's our arch enemy in this dunya, is that he threatens us with poverty and lack and deficiency so that we despair. And he commands us to open wrongdoing. So he takes us to a point of rebellion against the law. And these are dynamics that are operating in the unseen. So we have to have that understanding that goodness is what Allah wants for us. Unlimited goodness, if we really think about it, because Allah Ta'ala is calling us to Jannah. And what Shaitan does is undermines that activity that is in the unseen, so that it's disrupted. It's a connection that's there. We're being constantly called. We're being constantly reminded. And Shaitan threatens us in different ways. So the month of Ramadan, it exposes certain realities to us. And it exposes to us those realities which teach us how it is that Shaitan activates on our lives and how it is that we become people that deviate from that path. We're on a journey. We're taking our invitation that Allah Ta'ala is calling us to Jannah and to forgiveness, and then we find ourselves deviating. Well, we have a prophetic teaching which tells us a lot about Ramadan. إذا جاء رمضان فتحت أبواب الجنة وغلقت أبواب النار وسفدت الشياطين وسفدت الشياطين. So in this last part, we find that most of us hear this in this hadith, that the shayateen are enchained in Ramadan, and that Ramadan comes, that the gates of Jannah are opened and the gates of Jahannam, or the gates of the fire, are closed, and the shayateen are enchained. I wanted to pause for a moment here, because when we talk about how Allah calls us to Jannah and to forgiveness, and when we talk about how it is that shaitan threatens us with poverty and calls us to open rebellion and to sin against Allah Ta'ala, we have to realize that that activity of influence is taking place in many ways over our senses. Imam Izzuddin Abdul Salam, he teaches that the gates of Jannah being open have very much to do with the fact that we are displacing our attention from what is usually on. That we are depriving ourselves of sensual experiences, of eating, of drinking, of physical intimacy. We guard our eyes, we monitor our time, what we do as far as action. That comes back to, us being engaged in our senses. And we monitor our attitude towards people. And so this is one of the ways that shaitan loses influence over us, because the shayateen, they provoke us in different ways. Sin occurs by way of the hand, by way of the tongue, by way of the stomach, by way of the private parts, right? And so this is important to understand, that how it is that shaitan gains the influence over us is by us overindulging in our senses. And it's that simple, people. It's not utterly mysterious or something that's not workable in terms of achieving, when we start talking about spiritual development. It's simple from the angle of, it's clear. Discipline of the self leads to liberation. Discipline of the self with the intention of pleasing Allah, which separates us now from those who are practicing yoga, or those who are practicing dieting, or those who are practicing other types of regimens, because the intention behind this type of exercise, which we call fasting, is to please Allah Ta'ala, and is done in a form which is legislated by Allah. This ultimately, what it does is it disciplines us in such a way that we're able to get ourselves back in tune once again with our nature. And that nature is to be responsive to the call of Allah. And so that's done within the context of Ramadan. And in Ramadan, we find that it's a time period which is designated for this specific type of training. And we mentioned it before. A lot of times, what happens is that these lessons, we hear them every year, we forget, they grow faint for us. But we have to realize that a lot of damage is being done by overindulgence in the senses. Our children are becoming, many of them, disoriented, and us as adults as well. We find ourselves in a society which is indulging in food without boundary, and you see the end result of that. Or we find ourselves, in the society in which is overindulging in desire to such an extent that it leads to violence, it leads to the taking away of life. There was just a story that was just mentioned recently about in the news about a young boxer who ended up murdering a woman that she was young, that he was having an affair with. And he got her pregnant, and he was married. And he ended up killing her. And not only did he ended up killing her, First of all, he physically abused her, he drugged her, he shot her, he attached her to some cylinder bricks and then threw her in a lagoon. This, brothers and sisters, it has to do in many instances with us following our desire. And this is purely a manifestation of how Shaitan operates. And we find even medical doctors, they tell us, especially nowadays, there's more and more research that has been put out in the industry, so to speak, but we even find it in holistic medicine, that our gut leads a lot to our states of mind. So if our gut is healthy, then it contributes to our mental health. If our gut is unhealthy, it contributes to bad mental health. And the reason why we say this, brothers and sisters, is because the Muslims have understood this for a long time. Imam al-Balkhi, who wrote in the 9th century, understood that spirituality is related to good mental health, and good mental health is related to physical health. And those things don't come to us except by work and activity, right? And that work and activity, it is designated for us to understand. So when we talk about our actions and our deeds, we should be looking to see what those actions and deeds do to cultivate certain qualities for us, right? Not just think of them as being the means of getting into Jannah, rather thinking that the forgiveness of Allah is what we're trying to achieve, is what gets us into Jannah. And so when we look at fasting, fasting is to help us to attain taqwa. We talked about that in the last session. That's one of the qualities of fasting, one of the to cultivate taqwa. But the objective of fasting is that in itself, that we are able to implement the deen. We're able to garner enough strength to implement the deen, people. And this is where we start to talk about the issue of integrity, the issue of removing hypocrisy from ourselves. When we look at transformation of the human being, we talk about this much in the movement from the angle of tarbiyah, or the angle of formation or personal development. We have to realize that that is not an easy task. It comes gradually. And it comes, reshaping behavior and reshaping mental habits and reshaping emotional habits, the habit of the heart, and reshaping habits overall. It's not something which happens overnight. And so we find that Ramadan is a month long. And some personal life coaches, they talk about at least engaging in something for roughly about 40 days in order for it to be transformative, right? And so when we look at the reality of the fast is on about 30 days. And that is enough to be able, especially because we're at it with routine, the issue of the fast, the issue of qiyam, that's enough to be transformative of our habits, at least at the foundational stage. But it's not enough. And so that's why we find that in the Sunnah, we're recommended to fast after Ramadan, and we were recommended to fast before Ramadan, and not to consider those things as part of Ramadan. But what it does is it puts us into a modality where we get enough time in place to be able to cultivate ourselves. Ultimately, what we want people is to regain a sense of self and to recapture or liberate ourselves from the impact of shaitan. And so when we talk about good mental health, when we talk about self-discipline, when we start talking about cultivating a spiritual life, fasting is essential to that. Fasting is essential because what it does, and we have to teach this to our children, it teaches us how to control our sexuality. It teaches us how to discipline our anger. It teaches us how to contain our hunger. A lot of this stuff is what leads to the behaviors that we're seeing in today's time. The lack of control in those areas, the lack of discipline. And when we talk about the issue of suicide in the Muslim community, and even homicide that we're seeing in some cases, we have to realize that this is coming back to a number of different issues. It's coming back to faulty spiritual health. It's coming back to faulty emotional health. It's coming back to not being disciplined and allowing anger to get to ourselves. So we have to talk about the qualities of the heart, like the life of the heart. And we will come across that topic in the next section. The next session that we're going to encounter, we'll talk about the life of the heart with more detail. But in this session, we want to take away the importance of discipline of the self, the importance of discipline and focus, the importance of understanding that when we lose orientation, we lose control of ourselves, we're treading a path of self-destruction at the spiritual level, at the emotional level, that leads to other issues. That's not to say, that in every case we say that people are deficient of Iman when they have mental health problems. That's not what we want to associate. We want to just talk about the importance of mental health in the spiritual life. We want to talk about the importance of physical health in the spiritual life. And we want to talk about the importance of discipline in our development. And we want to talk about learning how to look at acts of worship as having certain objectives. And those objectives are to instill in us certain qualities so that at the end of the day, we're able to implement the deen. Because after all, one of the primary objectives of fasting is taqwa, which essentially means implementing the deen, implementing the command of Allah and safeguarding from the prohibition of Allah, so that we can enjoy being in the presence of Allah and strive to gain the pleasure of Allah. With that, we end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.